The air in the Elysian room did not simply fill the lungs, it occupied them. A dense, gilded atmosphere tasting of 100-year-old cognac and the silent, surgical removal of fortunes. Walls paneled in dark, lustrous mahogany seemed to absorb all sound, creating a vacuum where the clink of a fork on bone china was a percussive event. This was a cathedral of capitalism, a place where empires were consumed over plates of seared scallops and whispered conversations held the gravity of treaties. Tonight, at the prime corner table, shielded by a cascade of orchids, one such empire was being laid upon the altar. Aiko Yoshida, known to the men across from her as Aya, felt the silence as a shroud. By every legal and financial metric, she was the nexus of power at this table. As the sole granddaughter and designated heir of Kenji Yoshida, the visionary founder of Yoshida Precision, her signature was the final, indispensable seal on a deal that would merge his life's work with an American Leviathan. In practice, she was a specter at her own feast, a beautifully tailored ghost whose presence was a mere formality. Across the expanse of starched white linen sat the architects of this consumption. Arthur Caldwell was a man who seemed hewn from the very rock of Wall Street. His silver hair swept back with the precision of a financial statement, his eyes the pale, unforgiving blue of a winter sky. He had not spoken a single word to Aiko directly, instead addressing his remarks about her own company to the man on his right. That man was his son, Trent. Trent Caldwell was a sleeker, more polished predator than his father, clad in a suit that cost more than a car and wearing a smile that never reached his eyes. He radiated a bored, restless arrogance, periodically glancing at Aiko, not as a business partner, but as one might appraise an exotic, inanimate object he was about to acquire. He'd spent the last hour tapping at his phone, occasionally showing the screen to his father with a low chuckle, effectively building a digital wall around their side of the table. Completing their trinity was Marcus Thorne, the firm's chief counsel. Marcus was different. Where the Caldwells were overt in their power, Marcus was a study in stillness. He was a decade younger than Arthur, with a lean, ascetic face and watchful, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had been polite, his greeting to Aiko measured and correct, but his focus was entirely on the sheaf of documents resting beside his plate, his silence a form of professional disinterest that was, in its own way, as dismissive as Trent's open contempt. "The girl will have the fillet. Medium," Arthur had announced to the waiter earlier, a dismissive wave of his hand ending the matter. Aiko, who preferred her steak rare, had simply inclined her head, the gesture accompanied by a small, tight smile. It was the smile she had perfected over a lifetime of navigating the space between two worlds, her Japanese heritage and her American upbringing. Her grandfather, Kenji, had taught her the power of quiet observation. Her American education had taught her the necessity of speaking up. Tonight, the silence was a suffocating victory for the other side. Her grandfather was the reason she was here. A recent debilitating stroke had rendered the titan of industry silent, a vibrant mind trapped in a failing body. The board of Yoshida Precision, composed of men who had lived in Kenji's shadow for 40 years, had panicked. They saw the Caldwell Industries offer not as a merger, but as a golden parachute. Aiko saw it as the desecration of a legacy. She knew the Caldwell playbook: acquire, strip for patents, and discard the husk. But her protests were dismissed as the sentimental pleadings of a young woman who understood art and culture, not the brutal realities of the market. Her one fiercely negotiated condition, a seat at this final dinner, had been granted as a patronizing indulgence. "Of course, Aya, your presence is vital," they had cooed, vital as the wax seal on a death warrant. Moving through this silent, high-stakes drama with a practiced invisibility was Elena. Her uniform, a simple black sheath with a crisp white apron, was immaculate, but the fine lines around her eyes spoke of double shifts and the constant, draining effort of being unobtrusive. For 6 years, she had been a waitress at the Elysian Room, a tenure that made her part of the furniture. Invisibility was her professional armor, but it was also her lens. She could read a table with the acuity of a cryptographer. She saw the rigid line of Aiko's spine, the way her fingers, adorned with a single intricate ring, constantly traced the rim of her water glass. She saw Trent Caldwell's blatant disrespect, the way he angled his chair to physically exclude Aiko from his conversations with his father. She saw the cool, analytical detachment in Marcus Thorne's gaze as he scanned his documents, occasionally looking up to observe the dynamics with the impassive air of a biologist studying organisms in a petri dish. Elena had served oligarchs, disgraced senators, and tech demigods. She was a connoisseur of arrogance. She knew the quiet, polite cruelty that could bleed a person dry in a room full of crystal and silver. A strange, protective empathy stirred in Elena for the young woman at the corner table. There was a profound loneliness radiating from her, a quiet dignity under assault. She was a rare orchid being appraised by lumberjacks. As Elena approached to pour more water, Trent was laughing. The whole corporate soul thing Kenji Yoshida was famous for. It's a liability. We've identified redundancies in his artisan divisions. The custom tooling, the hand-finishing workshops, quaint but a drag on efficiency. We'll have them automated or outsourced within 6 months. Arthur Caldwell grunted his assent. Soul doesn't appear on a quarterly report. Our shareholders want value, not philosophy. The real prize is the patent portfolio. The rest is just a sentimental dead weight. Aiko's knuckles resting on the table went white. The artisan divisions were the heart of Yoshida Precision. They were the research and development labs where master craftsmen, using techniques passed down for generations, worked alongside engineers to create the unique materials and micro-tools that made their technology unparalleled. It was the fusion of old-world artistry and cutting-edge science. It was their soul. She opened her mouth, a protest forming on her lips. But Marcus Thorne chose that moment to interject, his voice a low, precise baritone. Speaking of the patents, Arthur, the report on the YP7 kinetic balancer is still a bit thin. The valuation seems disproportionate to its listed applications. Trent scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. It's a minor patent, Marcus. Some kind of vibration dampener for high-end optics. Finch's report says it's elegant but niche. A nice little trinket, but not the crown jewels. He then looked directly at Aiko, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. That's the one in your little ring, isn't it? Granddad's pet project? The word struck Aiko with the force of a physical blow. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the first prototype, a marvel of microengineering her grandfather had crafted himself. It was a symbol of everything he believed in. To hear it called a little trinket was a desecration. A wave of vertigo washed over her. The gilded air in the room suddenly felt too thin, too heavy. Her hand, trembling with a mixture of rage and grief, reached for the delicate porcelain cup of sake beside her plate. And in that moment of profound isolation, her control shattered. Her fingers fumbled. The small, elegant cup slipped, tipping over with a sharp crack against her plate, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sanctified quiet. Pale gold sake and shards of white porcelain bloomed across the pristine tablecloth. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the room was utterly silent. Every eye was on their table. Then Trent Caldwell let out a short, barking laugh. "A little jumpy, aren't we?" he drawled, fastidiously dabbing at an imaginary spot on his sleeve. "Don't worry. I'm sure your grandfather's company can cover the cost of a cup." The humiliation was a hot, searing wave. It was total. Aiko stared at the mess, her vision blurring, the carefully constructed facade of composure crumbling into dust. In a voice so low it was barely a whisper, a breath of pure despair, she murmured a phrase in Japanese, a line from an old engineering proverb her grandfather had drilled into her. "Kikai no kokoro ga wakarane." They don't understand the heart of the machine. To the men at the table, it was a meaningless, guttural sound, a sign of her losing her nerve. But it was not meaningless to Elena. Already moving forward with the instinct of a seasoned professional, armed with a fresh napkin, Elena froze for the barest fraction of a second. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met Aiko's. And for the first time that night, someone saw past the heiress to the woman. Leaning in close, her movements a seamless choreography of clearing the broken porcelain, Elena's voice was a soft, steady murmur meant only for Aiko's ear. Her tone was deeply respectful, formal, and her Japanese was not just fluent, it was technical, precise, and utterly flawless. Yoshida-sama, Daijubu desuka, she began, the honorific formal and correct. Then she added, her voice dropping even lower. YP7 no dongi shindo sochi. Sore wa chino no kisho desu. Karera wa rikai dekimasen. Are you all right, Miss Yoshida? The YP7 kinetic balancing mechanism. It is a crystal of ingenuity. They are incapable of understanding. The world stopped spinning. For Aiko, the words were a lifeline thrown into a churning sea of contempt. The Japanese, spoken with such unexpected precision, bypassed the boardroom jargon and struck a deep, resonant chord within her. But it was the second part, the technical designation, YP7 kinetic balancing mechanism. That was the true shock. Not a trinket, not a pet project, a crystal of ingenuity. In that moment, a waitress had shown more understanding of her grandfather's legacy than the men who were about to buy it. Aiko's head snapped up. Her wide, astonished eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, locked onto Elena's. The waitress's expression was calm, her face a mask of professional serenity. Yet her eyes held a spark of shared knowledge, a depth of comprehension that was utterly staggering. The oppressive weight on Aiko's chest lessened, replaced by a bewildering, electrifying sense of connection. The men at the table, however, were experiencing a different kind of shock. Their hermetically sealed world of power and privilege had just been breached by a variable they had never even considered. Arthur Caldwell's fork, laden with a piece of lobster, paused halfway to his mouth. He stared at Elena, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and irritation. He had registered the sounds as Japanese, but for them to emanate from his waitress, and with such authority, was a confounding anomaly. It was as if a painting on the wall had suddenly offered a critique of the decor. Trent's smirk dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed bewilderment. He looked from Elena to Aiko and back, his mind, accustomed to simple hierarchies, struggling to categorize this new development. The power dynamic, so firmly in his favor, had just been destabilized by the help. It was Marcus Thorne who recovered first, his legal mind instantly isolating and analyzing the new data point. He set down his pen, his gaze on Elena now sharp, calculating and stripped of all previous disinterest. "What was that?" he asked, his tone clipped, demanding. "What did you just say to her?" Elena did not look at him. Her focus remained on Aiko, even as her hands worked with swift efficiency to contain the spill. "I simply asked the young lady if she was feeling unwell, sir," she replied in perfect, unaccented English, her voice reverting to the deferential tone of a service professional. The sudden code switch was jarring, but Aiko was not letting the moment pass. She had found an unexpected ally in the trenches, and it had ignited something within her. She replied to Elena, her voice still trembling but infused with a new, defiant strength, speaking in Japanese. "I am fine. Thank you. Your words, they were a surprise, a welcome one." Elena gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, her work a model of discretion. "Endurance is also a form of precision, Yoshida-sama. They are testing the stress points." Agitated by an exchange he was excluded from, Trent slapped a hand on the table. "Hey, what is going on here? Speak English. What are you two plotting?" Arthur Caldwell held up a hand, silencing his son. His irritation was now eclipsed by a powerful curiosity. He looked at Elena, truly looked at her for the first time, not as an extension of his will, but as an individual. The uniform, the apron, the weary posture, they were all still there, but now they were overlaid with an aura of profound mystery. "You speak Japanese," he stated, the words a flat declaration demanding an explanation. "I do, sir," Elena said, straightening up, the bundled napkin with its hidden shards held discreetly in her hand. "How?" Arthur pressed, his voice sharp. "Where did a waitress learn that kind of language?" A new server was already hovering, ready to replace the soiled linen and reset the place setting. Elena gave him a brief nod, and he began his work as she answered Arthur's question. "I studied, sir. It was a required part of my former profession." The answer was a masterpiece of evasion, simple, factual, and utterly infuriating. The brevity, The lack of any fawning detail unsettled them. She wasn't trying to leverage her skill. She wasn't angling for a better tip. She was a closed book they suddenly, desperately wanted to read. Eiko watched this interchange, a revolutionary fire kindling in her gut. For an hour she had been an object. Now an unknown factor had been introduced into the equation, and the entire formula was changing. She decided to force the calculation. Turning to Arthur Caldwell, Eiko spoke, and for the first time that evening, her English was not the hesitant murmur of a subordinate, but the cool, clear alto of a leader. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, and all three men turned to face her, their full, undivided attention finally hers. "Perhaps your son is correct. Perhaps my grandfather's philosophies on corporate soul are quaint." She let the word hang in the air, a delicate, poisoned dart. He believed that you could not judge the strength of a machine without understanding its heart, its purpose, its soul. And he believed you cannot partner with a person or a company if you show no respect for their language, their culture, or their heart. She paused, her gaze sweeping over Trent's flushed face and Maline's thinning lips, before landing back on Arthur. He always said that the loudest voice in the room is often the one with the least to say. The real power is in listening. Trent's face was a mask of thunderous indignation. Marcus Thorne's expression was unreadable, but he had stopped looking at his papers entirely. Arthur Caldwell, however, did something unexpected. He ignored Eiko and turned his piercing gaze back to Elena, who was now standing respectfully by the service station. "Waitress," he called out, his voice a command that cut through the restaurant's murmur. "Come here." Elena walked back to the table, her face a neutral mask. "Miss Yoshida," Arthur said, his eyes still locked on Elena, "seems to believe we have a communication problem. A failure of respect, perhaps." The sarcasm was a thin veneer over a core of raw steel. "You seem to understand her world. From this moment, you will remain here. You will facilitate. If she speaks in her language, you will tell me exactly what she says." It was an outrageous command, a power play designed to reassert his dominance. He was attempting to turn Elena's mysterious skill into another tool for his own use, to reduce her back to a functionary, albeit a more specialized one. The restaurant manager, a perpetually anxious man named Gerard, scurried over, his face pale with alarm. "Mr. Caldwell, my deepest apologies for any disturbance, but Elena has other responsibilities. I will cover her entire night's wages and tips. Triple it," Arthur snapped without looking at him. "For tonight she is on my payroll. Now go away." Gerard vanished. Arthur then directed his full attention, a low and dangerous pressure, onto Elena. "Do you have an issue with that arrangement?" For the first time, a flicker of something, amusement, defiance, a hint of steel, crossed Elena's face. She glanced at Eiko, who gave the slightest, almost invisible nod of encouragement. In that silent, fleeting exchange, an alliance was sealed. "No, sir," Elena said, her voice perfectly level. "I have no issue with that." She took a position a few feet behind Eiko's chair, a silent, observant sentinel. "Where would you like to resume?" The dynamic of the evening had been irrevocably altered. One moment, Elena was a server. The next, she was a reluctant interpreter in a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. Arthur Caldwell clearly intended for her to be a human tape recorder, but both Elena and Eiko sensed a different opportunity unfolding. "Very well," Arthur began, leaning back and steepling his fingers, his equilibrium restored. He looked at Eiko. "Let's return to the artisan divisions. Our analysis, prepared by Dr. Alistair Finch, an expert in industrial processes, concludes that the manual tooling sections are a drain. We project a 30% increase in net profit by liquidating those assets and reinvesting in pure AI-driven automation." He then gestured toward Elena. "Make sure she understands the numbers." It was another petty, deliberate jab meant to re-establish Eiko's incompetence. Elena stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm and measured, "Ms. Yoshida is a graduate of Stanford, with a dual degree in symbolic systems and East Asian studies. She understands the numbers perfectly." She paused. "Perhaps the issue is not one of comprehension, but of context. Trent let out a derisive snort. Context? It's a simple cost-benefit analysis. The divisions are obsolete. With respect, Mr. Caldwell, Elena continued, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the son, you are referring to the workshops that developed the proprietary ceramic alloy composites for your company's own satellite guidance systems through a subcontract 3 years ago. You are referring to the craftsmen who perfected the diamond extrusion techniques that allow your microprocessors to run cooler and faster than any of your competitors. You call them obsolete. Your own engineers call them indispensable. A profound silence descended upon the table. Arthur Caldwell's eyes narrowed. Trent looked as if he'd been slapped. It was Marcus Thorne who spoke, his voice a low, intrigued rumble. How would you know that? The Elysian Room is a preferred dining location for many senior engineers from Caldwell Industries. Elena replied simply, they are often indiscreet when discussing their frustrations with corporate oversight. It was a stunning revelation. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a repository of corporate intelligence, gleaned from the unguarded conversations of the powerful. The invisible have the best listening posts. Trent, flustered and angry, lashed out. So you're a spy? Eavesdropping on our people? I just pour the wine, sir, Elena said, her expression unreadable. And I listen. It's amazing what you can learn about a company's weaknesses by listening to the people who do the actual work. Aiko seized the breach Elena had created. The artisan divisions are not a cost center, Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice now ringing with authority. They are our engine of innovation. My grandfather believes that true breakthroughs do not come from algorithms alone. They come from the place where human hands and human intuition meet the limits of material science. To destroy them would be to sever the heart from the brain of our company. It is not negotiable. Arthur Caldwell studied her, then Elena, then back to Aiko. He was a man who prided himself on finding leverage, on understanding his opponent's weaknesses. He had assumed Aiko's was her sentimentality. He had assumed Elena was irrelevant. He was profoundly wrong on both counts. This is ridiculous, Trent muttered, looking to his father for support. We're taking business advice from the waitstaff. Perhaps, Arthur said slowly, his gaze now thoughtful and dangerous. Or perhaps we've been given the wrong map. He turned his full attention to Aiko. Your board has already agreed to our terms in principle. They understand the need for modernization. This was the painful truth. The board, terrified of the future without Kenji at the helm, had been easily swayed by Caldwell's promises of lean, profitable efficiency. The board is scared, Aiko said, her voice softening with the pain of this reality. My grandfather is incapacitated. They are acting out of fear. But my grandfather made me promise one thing before he fell ill. He made me look at this ring. She held up her hand, the intricate piece of metal and crystal catching the light. He said, Aiko, they will come for the soul first. They will call it inefficient. They will call it waste. Your job is to protect the heart of the machine. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I heard you talk about selling it for scrap. She then turned slightly in her chair, looking up at Elena. She switched back to Japanese, her voice now carrying a note of genuine academic inquiry. Tell me, what do you see when you look at this? She gestured to the ring. To the Caldwells, it was a pretty, if complex, piece of jewelry. Elena's professional mask dissolved for a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated reverence. She took a half step closer, her eyes wide with recognition. Is that an original Kenji Yoshida kinetic sculpture? She breathed in Japanese. The YP7 prototype? The one that solved the resonance cascade problem in pico projectors? It is, Aiko replied, a small, sad smile on her face. The first one he ever made. He said it represented the balance. The outer cage is rigid and strong. That is the business, the structure. But inside, the core floats in a magnetic field, untouched, free to create. That is the soul. He said one cannot exist without the other. Elena stared at the ring, her expression one of awe. The floating core. It's a foundational piece of modern micromechanical engineering. It's elegant, brilliant. I have only ever seen it in schematics. I, I based my thesis on the principles it pioneered. The word hung in the air between them. Thesis. The fluid, meaningful conversation was an impenetrable wall for the Caldwell team. They were the outsiders now, stranded in a land where they did not speak the language, discussing a philosophy they could not comprehend. The isolation Aiko had felt for the entire evening had been transferred in its entirety to them. Trent's face was a mask of pure frustration. "What the hell is she saying? What's a thesis? What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising. It was Marcus Thorne who answered, though his question was directed at Elena. "Your thesis?" His voice was quiet, but it commanded the attention of the entire table. Elena turned back to them, her composure regained. She was no longer just a waitress or a translator. She was something else entirely. She looked at Marcus. "My doctoral thesis, sir, from MIT, in mechanical engineering and material science." The room went silent enough to hear a pin drop. A PhD from MIT, in engineering, serving them sea bass. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The neatly ordered boxes of their world had just been obliterated. "You're a doctor?" Trent stammered, the words catching in his throat. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Caldwell," Elena said, a ghost of a weary smile touching her lips. Aiko translated the meaning, if not the words, of their Japanese conversation for the stunned men. "Miss, she paused, realizing she didn't know her name. "Rostova," Elena supplied quietly. "Elena Rostova." "Dr. Rostova was explaining the principle behind the ring," Aiko said, her voice now imbued with the combined authority of her birthright and her newfound ally. "It is the foundational ethos of Yoshida precision, the balance between the rigid structure of commerce and the floating, creative soul of innovation. A concept you might translate as synergy. She is telling you that by liquidating the artisan divisions, you are not just breaking the cage. You are destroying the core it was built to protect. And that is something my grandfather and I will never allow." Arthur Caldwell was silent for a long, long time. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the murmur of other lives, faded into a dull roar. He was looking at his son, at Marcus, and finally at Aiko. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the girl, the placeholder, the rubber stamp. He was looking at Kenji Yoshida's granddaughter, and he was beginning to understand that the quiet, elegant woman he had so thoroughly dismissed was, in her own way, forged from the same unyielding steel as he was. The deal he had considered a formality was suddenly, inexplicably, disintegrating, and it was all because he and everyone on his team had failed to see the waitress. The revelation that Elena was a PhD from MIT hung over the table like a guillotine. The untouched fillet sat before Aiko, a symbol of the entire evening's miscalculations. The expensive Bordeaux in the Caldwell's glasses seemed to have soured. Arthur Caldwell, a man who had built an empire on the bedrock of predictable outcomes, decided to excavate the anomaly that now threatened his meticulously constructed deal, his gaze fixed on Elena, sharp and penetrating. "So, Dr. Rostova," he began, the honorific now a complex cocktail of sarcasm, respect, and disbelief. "You graduate with a doctorate in engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and you choose a career in hospitality. Forgive my bluntness, but there seems to be a significant narrative gap." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "As I said, Mr. Caldwell, life has its turns. The world of technological innovation is not always the meritocracy it claims to be." She paused, a shadow of an old, deep pain flickering in her eyes. "I was a lead researcher at a tech incubator. I developed a new process for creating self-repairing polymers. My supervising professor, the head of the institute, was a man named Dr. Alistair Finch." At the mention of the name, Marcus Thorne, who had been quietly observing, looked up from his notes, his body going still. His eyes narrowed with a flicker of recognition. "Alistair Finch," Arthur mused, "the industrial consultant, a giant in his field. He's the man who wrote our report on Yoshida precision." "He is," Elena agreed, a bitter metallic taste in her voice. "And he did not appreciate a junior researcher, a woman no less, developing a technology he had failed to create for years. He claimed my research was flawed, that my data was fabricated. Then when that failed, he altered my final submission, added his name to my patents, and presented my work as a joint venture, with himself as the senior partner. He effectively stole my life's work. She relayed this story not with melodrama, but with the cold, stark clarity of a legal deposition. It was the story of a brilliant career assassinated by the ego of a powerful man. There was a hearing, she continued. It was my word, my data logs, against his reputation. His lawyers buried me in litigation. I won officially. I retained a minor patent share, but I was financially ruined, and my name was tarnished by the accusation. No major tech firm would touch me. The story was that I was difficult, uncooperative. So I took a job that paid the bills, a job where no one asks about your past and you can disappear in plain sight. She finished with a wry glance around the opulent dining room, and I waited for an opportunity to find the right application for my work. Aiko listened, her heart aching with a shared sense of outrage. She too had been diminished, her worth judged and dismissed by powerful men who saw her only as a means to an end. Professor Finch, Aiko said softly, the name now tasting like poison. He is the one who valued the artisan divisions as worthless. He is the one who designated my grandfather's YP7 patent as a niche trinket. Marcus Thorne's pen clattered onto his plate. He looked at Arthur, his professional calm finally fracturing. Arthur, his voice was low and urgent, Alistair Finch is our sole independent consultant on this deal. Our entire financial strategy, our valuation of Yoshida's assets, the timeline for streamlining, it's all based on his report. His signature is on every appendix. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a closing prison door. This wasn't just a hostile takeover. It was a multi-billion-dollar act of personal revenge. Finch, having stolen Elena's past, was now trying to destroy Aiko's future. He was using Caldwell Industries as a blunt instrument to erase the very type of creative, intuitive engineering that Kenji Yoshida represented, the same type of genius he had stolen from Elena. He had labeled the heart of Yoshida Precision as worthless because he was a man incapable of creating such value himself. The valuation wasn't an objective financial assessment. It was a nihilistic act of intellectual vandalism. Trent looked completely adrift, his arrogance deflating into confusion. So what? Our whole play is based on some dusty professor's personal vendetta. It would appear so, Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet. The color had drained from his face. He had been played. His firm, his reputation, his legacy, all had been staked on the word of a compromised, vindictive fraud. They had walked into this negotiation blind, deaf and dumb, guided by a map drawn by their enemy's enemy. Their due diligence had been a catastrophic failure, a product of their own cultural and intellectual arrogance. They had seen Yoshida Precision as a simple equation to be solved, never bothering to question the integrity of the mathematician. Aiko felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and pure. The balance of power had not just shifted, the entire table had been flipped. She was no longer a defendant pleading for her legacy. She was the chief prosecutor. Mr. Caldwell, Aiko said, her voice now possessing the quiet, unshakable command she had so often admired in her grandfather. It appears your information is not merely flawed, it is corrupt. The artisan divisions are not a liability to be jettisoned. They are the crown jewels. Their value isn't in their liquidation price. It's in the intellectual property they generate, a concept your expert consultant conveniently failed to grasp. She then looked at Elena, a silent question in her eyes. Elena understood immediately. She stepped forward, her posture changing. The deferential waitress was gone. In her place stood Dr. Rostova, an expert witness reclaiming her voice. Mr. Caldwell's report fails to mention that the obsolete hand-tooling division is currently the only facility on Earth capable of manufacturing the focusing lenses for next-generation lithography machines. Elena began, her voice crisp and filled with the passion she had suppressed for 6 long years. That market alone is projected to be worth $50 billion within the next decade. The report dismisses the YP7 balancer as niche, yet it fails to mention its most vital application, which is still a Yoshida trade secret. It's the key to creating stable, room temperature quantum computing, not in 20 years. Now, she took a deliberate step closer to the table. You thought you were buying a collection of patents, but you failed to understand that the real value of Yoshida Precision isn't in the patents themselves. It's in the culture, the human ecosystem that creates them. By following Dr. Finch's advice, you wouldn't just be buying a company, you'd be paying billions to own a hollowed-out corpse with a tarnished brand. You would be executing the most expensive act of industrial suicide in modern history. Every word was a precision-guided missile, dismantling the entire premise of the Caldwell strategy. Arthur Caldwell, a man who prided himself on seeing every angle, sat in stunned silence, realizing he had been shown a deliberately fabricated and distorted sliver of the truth. He had been so fixated on the numbers that he had completely missed the meaning behind them. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shattered assumptions. The deal was not just in jeopardy. The very ground it was built on had been exposed as a toxic landfill. And the woman who now held all the cards was not the high-powered lawyer or the granite-faced CEO. It was the heiress he had ignored, aided by the waitress he had never seen. The illusion of control had evaporated. Arthur Caldwell, for the first time in his professional life, was utterly and completely outmaneuvered. He had come to conquer an empire and had instead been led into a minefield by a guide with a grudge. His path illuminated just before the final, fatal step by the one person he believed was invisible. He looked at his son, Trent, who was staring into his water glass as if it held the answers to a test he hadn't known he was taking. He saw not a successor, but a shallow reflection of his own worst instincts. He looked at Marcus Thorne, his brilliant legal mind, who was looking at Elena with an expression of profound, unadulterated respect. Finally, his gaze rested on Aiko. The timid ghost from the start of the dinner was gone. In her place sat a queen, poised, intelligent, and in absolute command. Power had not merely shifted to her side of the table, she had taken ownership of the entire room. It was Aiko who broke the devastating silence. "I believe," she said, her voice calm but carrying the chilling finality of a judge's gavel, "that our dinner is concluded." She placed her napkin neatly on the table beside her untouched plate. It was a gesture of dismissal. Panic flickered across Trent's face. Arthur opened his mouth to protest, to salvage something from the wreckage. But Aiko continued, cutting him off before he could begin. "This negotiation, the one based on the fraudulent premises of Dr. Finch's report, is over." She rose from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. Elena moved with her, a silent shadow. "My flight back to Tokyo is tomorrow evening. This presents you with a choice." Arthur Caldwell looked up at her, his face a granite mask of controlled fury and dawning realization. "A choice?" "A choice," Aiko affirmed. "You can proceed with this hostile takeover based on your current, corrupt intelligence. My board is weak. You may even succeed. You will acquire a company you do not understand, destroy its most valuable assets, and I will spend the rest of my life ensuring that every one of your investors knows that you were duped into paying a premium for a hollow shell. Your reputation will be ruined." She let that sink in before delivering the alternative. "Or, you can scrap this entire deal. You can publicly sever ties with Dr. Finch, citing professional misconduct. And tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, you can come to my hotel with a new proposal. Not an acquisition, a partnership, a joint venture where Yoshida Precision remains independent, but we work together, sharing technology and market access." She then turned her head to look at Elena, a presence as potent and silent as a drawn sword at her side. "And my first non-negotiable condition for any new discussion is this." Aiko looked back at Arthur. "Dr. Elena Rostova will be appointed as the head of a new, jointly funded research and development institute. The institute will absorb Yoshida's artisan divisions and be given the resources to pursue the very innovations Dr. Finch tried to bury. Her name will be cleared, her patents restored to her sole ownership, and her genius will finally be given the support it has always deserved." It was an audacious, breathtaking gambit. It was not about business. It was about justice. Aiko was not just saving her grandfather's company. She was restoring Elena's life. Elena's formidable composure, which had held firm through insults and revelations, finally wavered. Her eyes widened and she stared at Aiko in stunned, silent disbelief. A job. Her name cleared. Her life's work returned. It was more than she had allowed herself to hope for in 6 years of quiet desperation. Trent, finally finding his voice, sputtered, "This is blackmail. It's insane. We can't restructure a $50 billion deal around hiring the waitress." "Then there is no deal," Aiko replied instantly, her tone as cold and sharp as ice. "You can walk away and explain to your shareholders that you torpedoed the most significant international partnership in your company's history because your due diligence was incompetent and your pride was too great to admit it." She looked past him, her eyes locking with Arthur's. "The choice, Mr. Caldwell, is yours. A partnership built on strength and truth, or a victory built on ignorance and lies. You have until 10 a.m. With that, she turned. "Dr. Rostova," she said, her voice now softer, "you're coming with me." Without a backward glance, the two women walked out of the Elysian room, leaving the titans of Wall Street sitting amidst the ruins of their arrogance. The silence they had once used as a weapon now ringing with the sound of their own defeat. The next morning, the penthouse suite of the St. Regis felt like a command center in the quiet hours before dawn. Aiko and Elena had spent most of the night talking, not about the deal, but about everything that had led them to that moment. They spoke of Kenji Yoshida's wisdom, of the soul of machines, of the sting of betrayal, and the slow, grinding burden of being underestimated. A bond had been forged between them, tempered in the fire of last night's confrontation. Aiko had arranged for a courier to deliver a selection of clothes. Elena, now dressed in a simple but elegant charcoal pantsuit, looked less like a waitress and more like the brilliant scientist she was. The clothes were a superficial change, but they were also an armor, a visual confirmation of the shift that had occurred. "Are you certain they will come?" Elena asked, nursing a cup of green tea, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "He will come," Aiko said with confidence. "Arthur Caldwell is a predator, but he is not a fool. He knows when the prey he was hunting has turned out to be a dragon. The only question is what he will bring with him, a sword or a peace offering." Punctually at 10 a.m., there was a knock on the door. It was Arthur Caldwell and Marcus Thorne. Trent was conspicuously absent. Arthur's face was grim, the lines etched deeper than the night before. Marcus looked tired but clear-eyed, his expression one of professional respect. "Ms. Yoshida," Arthur began, his voice raspy. There was no apology, but its absence was a concession in itself. "We have reviewed your proposal." "It is not a proposal," Aiko corrected gently. "It is a statement of fact. It is the only path forward." The hours that followed were an intense, grueling negotiation, but the dynamic was entirely new. It was not a battle of adversaries, but a tense collaboration of equals. Aiko, with Elena providing astonishingly detailed technical and financial context, laid out the true value of Yoshida Precision. She spoke of the company not as a set of assets, but as a living philosophy. Elena, on a tablet, pulled up schematics, market projections, and research papers, deconstructing Finch's fraudulent report with surgical precision and outlining the immense untapped potential he had deliberately ignored. Arthur Caldwell, for his part, listened. For a man used to dominating every conversation, his silence was a testament to the seismic shock he had undergone. It was Marcus Thorne who did most of the talking for their side, asking sharp, intelligent questions, his mind working to build new bridges over the scorched earth of the old deal. He was a pragmatist, and he recognized the undeniable truth and opportunity in what Aiko and Elena were presenting. By midday, the framework of a new reality had been constructed. It was a true joint venture. Caldwell Industries would provide the capital and global distribution network. Yoshida Precision would remain an independent entity, its creative core protected, driving the technological innovation for both companies. And at the heart of it would be the new Yoshida Caldwell Institute for Advanced Materials, with Dr. Elena Rostova appointed as its inaugural director, given a blank check and full autonomy. "And Alistair Finch?" Aiko asked, her voice level. Marcus Thorne allowed himself a thin, grim smile. "Dr. Finch's consultancy contract has been terminated for cause. A full record of this negotiation, including Dr. Rostova's testimony and evidence of his fraudulent valuation, is being delivered to the ethics boards of every institution he is affiliated with. His time as a giant is over. Justice, it turned out, could be as swift and silent as a legal brief. The agreement was sealed not with a formal signing, but with a simple, firm handshake between Arthur and Aiko. He then turned to Elena. He extended his hand. "Dr. Rostova," he said, his voice holding a note of genuine, hard-won respect, "I look forward to reading your reports." "You'll find them to be accurate, Mr. Caldwell," Elena replied, shaking his hand, her grip steady. 6 months later, the setting was not an opulent restaurant, but a brightly lit, sprawling laboratory buzzing with quiet energy. The Yoshida Caldwell Institute hummed with the sound of 3D printers, focused conversation, and the soft whir of machinery. Aiko and Elena stood before a large holographic display, examining a complex, rotating schematic. It was a new application of the YP7 kinetic balancer, poised to revolutionize data storage. Elena, dressed in a lab coat over a simple dress, was animated, pointing out lines of code and material tolerances, completely in her element. The weariness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a brilliant, focused light. Aiko, in a sharp business suit, listened intently, asking insightful questions that bridged the gap between the technology and its market potential. They were partners, their skills perfectly complementary. Arthur Caldwell stood with them, watching the display with a look of humbled awe. He was a frequent visitor to the lab. He was learning a new language, not of contracts and conquests, but of creation and innovation. He was a changed man, quieter, more thoughtful. His son Trent had been reassigned to manage a subsidiary in a remote part of the world. A young engineer, barely out of university, approached them nervously, holding a prototype. It was a small, intricate device that shimmered under the lab lights. "Director Rostova, Miss Yoshida, we have a stable resonance," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Elena took the device with the reverence a curator would show a priceless artifact. She examined it, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. She looked at Aiko. "The heart of the machine," Elena said softly. "It's beating perfectly." Aiko smiled back, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "That's because it's in the hands of someone who understands it." They stood together in the clean, bright light of the laboratory. Two women from impossibly different worlds, now architects of the same future. They were no longer an heiress and a waitress, a ghost and a shadow. They were innovators, leaders, and friends. Their partnership, forged in a moment of humiliation and defiance in a dark, gilded room, was now creating a future brighter than either of them could have imagined. And it had all started with a shattered cup, a whispered phrase, and the quiet courage to recognize the unseen genius in the person standing right in front of you.